Is tithing Catholic? Well, of course it is, because it's biblical. And for we Catholics, we know that we've heard tithing as being Protestant, and much of what we've heard and what we probably remember is from the Old Testament because it's very clearly described as part of the law of Moses, that a portion of what we have is set aside for God, and it's called the tithe. It is not the leftovers, it's the first and the best. And so we know that in that biblical tradition of the Old Testament, it was being lived out at the time of Jesus. And people often mistakenly say, well, Jesus didn't talk about tithing. Oh, yes, he did. And in fact, in Luke's gospel is a good example where Jesus himself uses the word tithe twice. And when we look at when Jesus uses a word twice, and he uses them in the exact same context, we understand that that's a literary device that was created by the author to teach a larger story. Let's look at how Jesus talks about tithing. You turn to the Gospel of Luke, chapter 11, verse 42. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you frauds! You tithe on mint and rue and all the garden plants, while neglecting justice and the love for God. These you should have practiced, without neglecting the others. Now let's stop right there. What's happening? Jesus is talking about the Pharisee who tithes on mint and rue and all the garden plants. Why would he talk about something like that? Well, because, you see, you tithe on your entire income. You see, if you have your backyard garden and your wife is growing everything, well, she then sells it to the neighbor. And if you sell it, then you should take a portion of that and give it as part of your tithe. You would then be considered a rigorous tither if you tithe on the income that came from your backyard garden. You would be a good tither. Okay? So the Pharisee can proudly say, I tithe on my entire income if you tithe on your backyard garden. That's what Jesus is talking about. Now, you switch over to the 18th chapter of Luke's Gospel. Jesus himself gives a parable of two people who go to the temple to pray. And Jesus says that a Pharisee and a tax collector goes to the temple to pray. And the Pharisee says to himself, oh, thank God I'm not like these wretched people here, And then he praises himself. Oh God, I fast twice a week. I tithe on my entire income. What? That should echo from what I just read in chapter 11. Now, what happens is you have to understand a bigger context. And we do this in biblical studies. We start to understand what were the circumstances at the time Jesus spoke this. Well, there's a very big circumstance. And this is hard for a lot of people to understand because they never really have been very critical about how Jewish people thought at the time of Jesus. Well, there wasn't one Jewish thought. There were at least four. And the first one were the Zealots. They were trying to kick out Rome and they were very political. Jesus wasn't a zealot. We know that he had one of his apostles, Simon, from the Zealot party member. Okay, so we know there's a zealot party. It says so right in the Bible. And then there were the Essenes. The Essenes were people that lived out in the desert. They rejected Jerusalem worship. Well, Jesus can't be an Essene. He worships in the temple. Well, then that leaves you two other groups, Sadducees and Pharisees. Well, Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection of the dead or angels. So what does that leave Jesus? Pharisee. People say, well, wait a minute. Jesus is always arguing with the Pharisees. You're right, he is. This is an in-house fight in Pharisaic thinking. What? Yes. If you only know this is the key that unlocks every argument between Jesus and the Pharisees. Because Jesus is arguing as a Pharisee within the Pharisee party this distinction. Is it your actions that count or your intentions that count? This idea is so very old. You can go back to the book of the prophet Ezekiel. And what was the complaint there? Your ways are not fair. Of course they're fair. And this is the key. You can't be a scorekeeper. If you're a scorekeeper and you think, okay, I've done 25 good deeds and then I've done 5 bad deeds, I have credit. So then at the end, I net 20, I'm saved. No, you aren't. You committed 5 bad deeds at the end. It corrupts everything. You lose. And if you have committed 25 terrible things, and then at the end of your life you convert and do 5 good things, well, you're a loser. No, you don't. You win. That's not fair. It's not keeping score. That's the circumstance of Jesus at the time of the Pharisees. There's his argument. Do you keep score, or is it your intention? The rigorous tithing Pharisee would think that he's won because he's rigorously following the law. I tithe on my entire income, the 2 elements of the literary device. But the remaining part is the story that's Christian. What is your intention in following the law of the Lord? Do you do it out of love for God? Do you have a perfect intention? That's what Jesus is after. The perfecting of our purifying of our intentions so that we're tithing for the right reasons. So he said you should have loved justice and the love for God. Those are the highest priority. That's the right intention. But you cannot neglect to do tithing. But if all you do is tithing and you think that'll make up for violating justice and love for God out of love of God and neighbor, you're fooling yourself. That's the message of Jesus Christ. Jesus tells us to tithe. Wow, I didn't know that's what that meant. Yes, you violate justice and the love for God. These you should have practiced without neglecting tithing. And he did it in that context of chapter 11 to verse 18. Now you realize it's bookends. And in a Bible study, you can start looking at parable after parable after parable. And these have a stewardship context to it. The lost coin, the dishonest steward, the 10 lepers. Now, the 10 lepers, for instance, is one of those readings that's used in the liturgy as a regular reading that we preach upon. And we know there's layers of meaning to it. But one of the layers has to do with stewardship. Because you remember, there's 10. And the 1/10th portion comes back out of gratitude for God. That's the argument of Jesus in the in-house fight of Pharisees. Is you do it for the right intentions. You do it out of gratitude for God. Isn't that curious that there's a stewardship parable in between 2 bookends that start with stewardship? That would be my start-off point to talk to my fellow Catholics that yes, tithing is Catholic. It's very biblical, and Jesus himself tells us that we have to do tithing, but do it with the right reasons and with purified intentions.